Somewhere in Ukraine right now, there's a document that Vladimir Putin would give almost anything to see. It's short, it's classified, and it names the next set of places inside Russia that Ukrainian drones and missiles are about to turn into craters. Nobody in the Kremlin knows what's on it. Nobody in Russian air defense knows where to point their radars next. And that, more than any single strike, might be the most dangerous thing Ukraine has built all year. Uncertainty, weaponized and aimed straight at Moscow. On July 26th, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sat down with his top military leadership and walked out with an updated list of priority targets for Ukraine's long-range strike campaign inside Russia. That's the headline. The details, deliberately, are not. Zelensky confirmed the list exists, confirmed the strategy behind it, and then said almost nothing about what's actually on it. Which is exactly the point. Because if there's one thing this war has taught both sides, it's that the element you can't see coming is the one that actually hurts. Think about how differently this plays out for each side. Russia has spent years launching missiles and drones at Ukrainian cities with the target essentially telegraphed in advance, since the possible destinations are limited and the intent is usually terror rather than precision. Ukraine's approach is the opposite, a tightly held list, aimed at very specific choke points in Russia's war economy, released to the public in name only. One side is trying to be seen, the other is trying to stay invisible for as long as possible, right up until the moment the drones are already in the air and there's nothing left to defend against. That asymmetry is the whole story here, and it's why this particular announcement matters more than it might look like on the surface. So today we're doing something a little different. Instead of asking what Ukraine is planning to hit, we're asking the other side of that question. What does Russia not know? What is Putin's government blind to right now, at this exact moment, as Ukrainian commanders finalize strike packages against a list Moscow can't read? Because once you start pulling on that thread, you realize just how exposed Russia's rear actually is, and how little control the Kremlin has over what happens next. The announcement nobody was supposed to understand. Let's start with what we actually know, since there isn't much of it. Zelensky's statement came after a meeting with Ukraine's new commander-in-chief, Mikhailo Drapachy, Chief of the General Staff Ihor Skybyuk, and Acting Defense Minister Yevgeny Kamara. The takeaway from that meeting was simple on paper. Continue the long-range strike campaign, and refresh the list of priorities based on which targets do the most damage to Russia's ability to keep fighting this war. Zelensky called it, once again, a plan of, quote, long-range sanctions. It's a phrase he's used before, and it's a useful one, because it reframes the entire campaign in economic terms, rather than purely military ones. This isn't just about blowing up an airbase here or a radar station there. It's about bleeding Russia's economy, its logistics, and its war production capacity, one strike at a time, until the cost of continuing the invasion outweighs whatever Putin thinks he's still fighting for. What makes this list different from previous target updates is timing. It comes at the tail end of a year that has already seen more than 1,000 long-range strike missions launched into Russian territory, hitting oil refineries, military production sites, and logistics hubs across the country. It comes just days after Ukrainian drones struck the Omsk refinery, roughly 2,500 kilometers from the border, and the Tyumen refinery not far behind it. It comes with Ukrainian officials openly stating that strike range now regularly exceeds 3,000 kilometers. In other words, this list wasn't written in a vacuum. It was written by people who now have the reach to hit almost anywhere in western and central Russia, and possibly farther, and who are choosing, very deliberately, not to tell anyone which parts of that map they're circling next. It also comes at a moment of genuine leadership change inside Ukraine's military, which shouldn't be overlooked. Drapachy only took over as commander-in-chief on July 22nd, replacing outgoing commander Oleksandr Syrskyi, which means this list is effectively his first real fingerprint on the war's most consequential campaign. Whether he steers it toward more symbolic strikes, more economic ones, or some hybrid of both, will say a lot about how he plans to run this next phase. And it's reasonable to assume Moscow is watching his early decisions just as closely as anyone else, trying to read a new commander's instincts before the strikes even land. Why silence is the weapon. Here's the obvious question. Why not just release the list, or at least a version of it? Wouldn't that add pressure, force Russia to spread its defenses thinner, maybe even trigger panic in regions that suddenly realize they're on the map? On the surface, that sounds tempting. In practice, it would hand the Kremlin exactly what it needs most right now, which is time. Russia's air defense network is not infinite. It's concentrated, heavily, around a handful of places that matter most to the political and military leadership: Moscow, the Crimean Bridge, St. Petersburg, and the government's own residences. Everywhere else, coverage thins out fast, and in some regions it barely exists at all. If Ukraine published its next set of targets, Moscow would simply reroute batteries toward the named sites, and whatever advantage those targets offered would evaporate before a single drone left the ground. So the list stays sealed. And that single decision creates a specific kind of problem for Russian planners, one that has nothing to do with missiles or explosives and everything to do with psychology. Every refinery manager, every logistics officer, every regional governor now has to operate under the assumption that their facility might already be on it. Nobody knows if they're a priority or an afterthought. That kind of uncertainty spreads slowly through a bureaucracy, and it's brutally hard to plan around, because there's no way to prepare for a threat you can't locate. There's a second layer to this too, one that's easy to miss if you're only thinking about individual targets. Uncertainty at this scale doesn't just sit quietly inside government offices. It bleeds into how ordinary Russians think about their own safety, and that's arguably worth more to Ukraine than any single successful strike. A population that assumes its refineries, warehouses, and logistics hubs are permanently secure behaves very differently from one that suspects any of them could be next. The former keeps calm and keeps producing. The latter starts asking harder questions about why its government keeps insisting the war is going well, while the fires keep spreading closer to home. Clue 1. Russia doesn't know where its own weak points are anymore. This is the part that should actually worry the Kremlin most. Zelensky has pointed out more than once that Russia's strategic depth, its sheer size, long treated as one of its greatest defensive assets, has quietly become a liability. Air defense systems can't cover a landmass that large evenly. They have to be moved, concentrated, and prioritized. And every time Moscow shifts a battery to protect one region, it opens a gap somewhere else. There are already reports of Russian air defense units being pulled away from the Arctic to reinforce coverage closer to the political core of the country. That's a defensive choice made under pressure, and it tells you something important. Russia is reacting to Ukraine's campaign, not anticipating it. Every relocation is essentially an admission that the previous setup wasn't holding, and every admission gives Ukrainian planners fresh information about where the gaps are opening next, which raises an uncomfortable possibility for Moscow. If Ukraine is tracking these troop and system movements in real time, and there's plenty of reason to think it is, then the new priority list may not be built entirely around symbolic value. Some of it may simply be built around opportunity, striking wherever Russian air defense has just thinned out because it got pulled somewhere else. Russia's own defensive instincts could be quietly writing part of Ukraine's target list for it, and nobody in the Kremlin would necessarily know that's happening until the strikes start landing in the exact gaps they just created. Clue 2. The economic bleed isn't slowing down. If you want a preview of where this list is likely heading, you don't need classified intelligence. You just need to look at what Ukraine has already been hitting, because that pattern rarely changes overnight. Take Wildberries, Russia's largest online retailer and, less obviously, a major logistics backbone for military-adjacent supply chains. Ukrainian strikes have already knocked out roughly a tenth of the company's warehouse and inventory capacity, according to reporting from late July, with damage estimates running into the billions of dollars. That's not a symbolic target. That's an attempt to choke off a supply artery that Russian forces have come to depend on. And with roughly 90% of Wildberries' network still standing, there's a lot more room for that campaign to grow if it's included in the refreshed list. Then there's the oil sector, which has absorbed hit after hit throughout 2026. Refineries once considered safely out of range, tucked deep in Siberia or near the Urals, are now demonstrably reachable, and reachable repeatedly. Petrol rationing has already spread across more than a dozen Russian regions as a direct consequence. If the new list leans further into this economic angle, and everything about Ukraine's public messaging suggests it will, expect more refineries, more fuel depots, and more pressure on an energy sector that Russia genuinely cannot afford to keep losing. And Russia doesn't know, with any real precision, which refinery is next. That's not a small detail. Refinery operators can harden a facility, disperse fuel stockpiles, or reinforce air defense around a single site, but they can't do that for every refinery in the country simultaneously. Somewhere on that list is a name Russian energy officials haven't even flagged as vulnerable yet. There's also a quieter campaign running alongside all of this that rarely gets the same attention as the drone strikes, and that's the systematic targeting of Russia's shadow fleet in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. By late July, Ukraine had struck more than 190 of these vessels, the tankers and cargo ships Russia relies on to move sanctioned oil around the world while dodging international restrictions. Every ship taken out of that fleet is a direct hit on the revenue stream funding the war, and it's a campaign that doesn't need a public target list at all, since the ships themselves are the targets, wherever they happen to be sailing. If the updated priority list folds in more of this maritime pressure alongside the refineries, Russia's oil export logistics could be looking at damage on two fronts simultaneously, at sea and on land, with no way to fully shield either one. Clue 3. The symbolic targets are still on the table. Alongside the economic targets sits a different category entirely, the kind of strikes that aren't really about disrupting supply chains at all. They're about reputation. Zelensky has specifically referenced Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the Crimean Bridge as places where Russia's air defense concentration is heaviest, and yet Ukrainian drones have repeatedly managed to punch through anyway. That's worth sitting with for a second. These are supposed to be the best defended locations in the entire country. Moscow is the seat of Putin's power. St. Petersburg is his hometown and a city loaded with personal and historical significance. The Crimean Bridge is the physical, symbolic link between Russia and the peninsula it annexed. Every successful strike near any of these places chips away at the narrative Putin has spent years building, that Russia is untouchable at home, no matter what happens on the front line. Just days after the new list was confirmed, Ukraine sent 390 drones into the Moscow region in a single operation. Russian officials claimed most were intercepted. Whether that's fully accurate or not almost doesn't matter, because the message landed regardless. Moscow isn't safe. It never fully was, but now everyone watching has been reminded of it, including the people whose job it is to convince Putin otherwise. The part Russia really can't see coming. Here's where this gets genuinely uncomfortable for Moscow, and it has nothing to do with the target list itself. It's about what's coming next in terms of raw capability, because the goalposts keep moving. Ukraine's drones can already reach more than 3,000 kilometers, enough to put huge stretches of Siberia and the Ural region within range. Zelensky has said Ukraine is actively working to push that figure to 4,000 kilometers before the end of 2026, which would bring Russia's Far East into the conversation for the first time. And he's gone further than that, suggesting that 2027 could bring drones capable of traveling between 5,000 and 10,000 kilometers. He didn't offer much technical detail, which is understandable, but making a claim like that publicly usually means the capability already exists in some form, even if it hasn't been demonstrated yet. Layer on top of that Ukraine's growing ballistic missile program. Firepoint, the manufacturer behind several of Ukraine's long-range strike drones, is reportedly close to fielding two new missiles, the FP-7, with a range up to 200 kilometers, and the FP-9, capable of reaching roughly 855 kilometers. Firepoint's own chief designer has suggested the weapon could be ready for use against Russia as early as this fall. If that timeline holds, some of the sites already weakened by drone strikes this year could go from damaged to permanently destroyed, hit with a payload no drone currently in Ukraine's arsenal can match. Put those two threads together and you get the real problem for Russian defense planners. It isn't just that they don't know what's on the list, it's that the list itself is a moving target, expanding in both reach and destructive power every few months. Whatever assumptions Russian air defense commanders are making right now about which regions are theoretically safe could be obsolete by winter. What Russia thinks it knows, and why that might be the trap. There's a tempting theory here, and it's worth addressing directly. Some analysts have floated the idea that by naming a few high-profile locations publicly, Kiev might actually be trying to bait Russia into over-defending certain sites while quietly reserving the real priority targets elsewhere. It's a classic misdirection play, and honestly, it would fit the pattern of everything else Ukraine has done this year. Whether that's actually what's happening or just useful ambiguity is impossible to say from the outside, and Ukraine has every incentive to keep it that way. But either interpretation leads to the same uncomfortable place for Moscow. If the named sites are the real targets, Russia already knows where to reinforce and still can't stop the strikes from getting through. If they're a decoy, Russia is about to pour resources into defending the wrong places entirely, while the actual targets sit exposed. There is no version of this where Russian planners can simply relax. The end goal hasn't changed, even if Putin won't admit it. Strip away the individual targets, and the strategy underneath all of this is straightforward. Ukraine wants to make continuing this war as expensive and as personally uncomfortable for Putin as possible, in the hope that enough accumulated pressure eventually pushes him toward genuine negotiations. Zelensky has said as much directly, framing the strike campaign as a way of creating the conditions for real diplomacy rather than an end in itself. The trouble is that reporting from inside Russia suggests Putin isn't anywhere close to that point yet. Sources close to the Kremlin have indicated he's unlikely to seriously engage with peace talks before at least February 2027, and Russia's public negotiating posture reflects that. Rather than treating the mounting refinery damage, the fuel shortages, and the repeated strikes near Moscow as reasons to reconsider his position, Putin appears to be doing the opposite, hardening his demands and insisting Russia still holds the advantage, despite a growing pile of evidence suggesting otherwise. That disconnect is the real story here. Ukraine is applying pressure through a campaign specifically designed to be unpredictable, expanding in range, and increasingly difficult to defend against, while the one person capable of ending it appears determined to wait it out. The Kremlin recently dismissed reports of a possible U.S.-brokered air truce as unconfirmed speculation, hardly the reaction of a government eager to stop what's coming. The bottom line. So what does Russia actually not know when you add it all up? It doesn't know which sites made the final cut on Ukraine's updated priority list. It doesn't know whether its own defensive repositioning is creating new gaps faster than it's closing old ones. It doesn't know how much farther Ukrainian drone range will stretch by the end of this year, let alone next. And it doesn't know when or if Ukraine's ballistic missile program crosses from development into deployment. What it does know is limited to what it's already lived through: refineries burning, warehouses collapsing, fuel rationed in over a dozen regions, and drones reaching cities that were supposed to be untouchable. If that's the visible part of the campaign, the part Ukraine has been willing to confirm publicly, it's worth remembering that the actual list, the one sitting in front of Zelensky's commanders right now, is still sealed. Keep an eye on this over the coming weeks. Given how this year has gone, it's a safe bet we'll be covering more than a few of these newly named priorities as they get hit, whether Russia sees them coming or not.